Margaret Carter believed she had made a responsible decision, but the quiet certainty she carried home from that phone call began to unravel faster than she expected as distant relatives and hospital staff continued reaching out with updates she had not asked for and emotions she was not prepared to face. Inside the neonatal intensive care unit, Noah Carter remained surrounded by a network of medical professionals who rotated through 12-hour shifts, carefully tracking his growth and adjusting his care plan as he responded to treatment with steady but fragile progress, while Emily Carter slowly emerged from sedation unaware that her mother had declined every invitation to visit, participate in care discussions, or even receive regular updates about her grandson's condition. Nurses attempted to encourage Margaret to reconsider by explaining that premature infants often benefited from early family bonding, sharing research about the emotional stability such involvement could provide both mother and child. But Margaret maintained her distance, politely but firmly repeating that she trusted the hospital's expertise and believed her presence would not change medical outcomes. Among extended family members, confusion began spreading quietly during phone conversations and text message chains as Emily's younger cousin, Rachel Bennett, learned about the situation through her own contact with the hospital social worker assigned to Emily's case, and Rachel struggled to understand how Margaret, who had built a career advocating for children's development and educational opportunity, could now hesitate to support her own grandson during such a critical time. Rachel attempted to speak privately with Margaret, reminding her that Emily had always relied on her mother as her strongest emotional anchor after the passing of Emily's father nearly 15 years earlier, but Margaret dismissed the conversation by emphasizing practical concerns about her health, her financial stability, and her belief that Emily had chosen to become a single parent and therefore needed to demonstrate independence during difficult circumstances. Meanwhile, Emily's recovery progressed slowly as doctors monitored her physical healing and gradually reduced medication levels, allowing her to regain awareness of her surroundings through a haze of exhaustion and confusion, often asking nurses fragmented questions about her baby without fully processing the answers she received, her mind clinging to memories of pregnancy milestones, rather than confronting the reality unfolding around her. Hospital staff provided gentle reassurance whenever Emily asked whether her mother had been informed about the delivery, offering neutral responses that avoided revealing Margaret's absence, while social workers quietly documented the growing emotional gap forming between Emily and her closest family member. Outside the hospital environment, Margaret attempted to maintain her normal routine, attending community volunteer meetings and weekly grocery trips where neighbors asked casual questions about Emily's expected delivery date, and Margaret responded with vague optimism, explaining that the baby had arrived early but was receiving excellent care, carefully avoiding any details that might expose her personal decision to remain uninvolved. However, Margaret's confidence began to weaken as she received occasional photographs sent by Rachel, showing Noah resting peacefully in his incubator with tiny knitted hats donated by local charities and identification bracelets that seemed far too large for his delicate wrists. Images that lingered in Margaret's thoughts long after she silenced her phone and placed it face down on her kitchen counter. At the hospital, Noah continued to show quiet determination as respiratory therapists gradually reduced his oxygen support and neonatal specialists noted subtle, but encouraging signs of developmental strength. Yet nurses observed that he spent most of his comfort holding sessions with trained volunteers rather than family members, an arrangement that met medical guidelines but left an emotional absence that staff rarely discussed aloud. Emily eventually regained full consciousness nearly 10 days after the delivery, her first clear memory forming when she noticed the sterile white ceiling above her hospital bed and instinctively placed her hands across her abdomen, realizing with sudden clarity that her pregnancy had ended without her experiencing the moment she had imagined for months. When she asked to see her baby, nurses arranged a carefully supervised visit to the neonatal unit, guiding her wheelchair through long hospital corridors while explaining the equipment she would encounter. And when Emily finally saw Noah through the clear incubator walls, she felt a mixture of overwhelming love and quiet fear as she studied his tiny fingers wrapped around a monitoring tube, whispering promises that she would protect him no matter what challenges lay ahead. During that visit, Emily asked whether her mother knew about Noah's birth, expecting reassurance that Margaret would arrive soon, but the nurse assisting her hesitated briefly before explaining that Margaret had been informed but had not yet scheduled a visit, a revelation that settled into Emily's heart with a heavy stillness she could not immediately express, leaving her staring at her newborn son while realizing that the family support she had always believed would surround them might not be coming at all. Emily Carter tried to convince herself that her mother simply needed time to adjust. But as days turned into weeks inside the structured rhythm of hospital recovery and neonatal monitoring, the absence of Margaret Carter became a quiet certainty that Emily could no longer ignore. Each morning, Emily followed the same routine that nurses helped her learn, beginning with physical therapy exercises designed to rebuild her strength before she was escorted to the neonatal intensive care unit where Noah Carter continued his fragile but steady progress. And with each visit, Emily memorized every detail about her son's appearance, from the faint swirl of sandy brown hair along his scalp to the gentle rise and fall of his chest that reassured her he was still fighting. Medical staff educated Emily about premature infant care, explaining feeding schedules measured in carefully calculated ounces, temperature regulation requirements, and developmental milestones that might arrive later than those of full-term infants, and Emily listened with focused determination, writing notes in a small spiral notebook she kept in her hospital bag, determined to master every aspect of Noah's care, regardless of how overwhelming the information seemed. Throughout this process, social workers and nurses continued encouraging Emily to rely on family support, occasionally asking whether she wanted them to contact Margaret again, but Emily initially declined, explaining that her mother would come when she felt ready, although her voice carried less certainty each time she repeated those words. Meanwhile, Margaret maintained her distance, responding to occasional text messages from Rachel Bennett with brief updates about her daily activities, but rarely asking detailed questions about Noah's condition, choosing instead to focus on practical matters such as whether Emily's apartment lease would need adjustment or whether insurance coverage would handle extended hospital stays, subjects that allowed Margaret to maintain emotional distance while convincing herself she was still contributing in responsible ways. As Emily gained strength, hospital staff gradually allowed her to participate more directly in Noah's care, teaching her how to hold him safely during supervised bonding sessions where she learned to support his delicate frame while nurses monitored his vital signs, moments that filled Emily with a profound mixture of joy and anxiety, as she whispered softly to him about the home she hoped to build once he was strong enough to leave the hospital. During one of these sessions, Emily overheard another family celebrating their premature infant's progress with grandparents and siblings gathered around, sharing laughter and tears that echoed through the softly lit neonatal unit. And although Emily smiled politely when those families acknowledged her, she felt an ache growing inside her as she realized that her own support circle felt painfully small. That evening, Emily finally asked the hospital's social worker, Daniel Harris, whether her mother had provided any explanation for her absence, and Daniel carefully explained that Margaret had expressed concerns about her ability to manage the responsibilities associated with caring for a medically sensitive child, emphasizing that Margaret's statements had been delivered calmly and without hostility, yet the information struck Emily with quiet devastation as she struggled to reconcile the nurturing parent she remembered with the distant figure now described by hospital records. Emily spent that night replaying childhood memories of school recitals, holiday traditions, and long conversations with her mother about perseverance and family loyalty, wondering how those values seemed to have dissolved during the moment she needed them most. The following morning, Emily requested permission to make a phone call, and with nurses offering privacy, she contacted Margaret directly for the first time since the accident, her voice trembling as she explained Noah's improving condition and her hopes that Margaret might consider visiting. But Margaret responded with polite concern rather than emotional warmth, stating that she was glad Noah was receiving excellent medical attention, and suggesting that Emily focus on recovery before worrying about extended family involvement, words that sounded reasonable on the surface yet carried an unmistakable finality that left Emily staring silently at her phone long after the call ended. Despite the disappointment, Emily redirected her energy toward preparing for Noah's eventual discharge, attending parenting classes offered by the hospital, learning infant cardiopulmonary resuscitation techniques, and meeting with financial counselors who explained potential costs associated with specialized pediatric care, all while balancing her own medical appointments and therapy sessions that tracked her recovery progress. Over the next several weeks, Noah reached critical developmental milestones that allowed doctors to gradually reduce monitoring equipment, celebrating his weight gain as he approached 5 pounds and demonstrating stronger feeding reflexes that suggested he might soon be ready to transition home. And although nurses praised Emily's dedication and resilience, they also observed the emotional exhaustion that surfaced during quiet moments when Emily believed no one was watching. Rachel visited frequently, bringing home cooked meals and helping Emily organize paperwork, offering the emotional support Margaret had withheld. Yet Rachel carefully avoided criticizing Margaret directly, understanding that Emily's bond with her mother remained complicated and deeply rooted in years of shared history. As Noah prepared for discharge planning, Emily realized she was stepping into single parenthood under circumstances she had never anticipated. Standing in the hospital hallway one evening watching the sunset filter through tall windows while holding her son against her chest, silently acknowledging that while she had survived the accident and Noah had survived premature birth, the loss of her mother's support felt like a separate heartbreak she was only beginning to understand. Several days before Noah Carter was scheduled to leave the hospital, a conversation took place that would quietly shape the direction of his future without Margaret Carter ever knowing it. Beginning during a routine evaluation when a pediatric genetics specialist named Dr. Leonard Whitaker requested permission to review Noah's test results in greater detail. Emily Carter sat inside a small consultation room decorated with calming pastel artwork while Noah slept in a portable bassinet beside her, listening as Dr. Whitaker explained that certain blood markers observed during Noah's neonatal screenings showed unusual patterns that had prompted further laboratory analysis. Dr. Whitaker spoke carefully, emphasizing that the findings were not a cause for immediate concern but rather a rare biological characteristic that appeared to demonstrate a heightened immune system response, one that medical researchers occasionally encountered but rarely documented in premature infants, and he explained that this discovery might help scientists better understand how some children naturally resist infections that typically threaten fragile newborns. Emily struggled to process the technical language while focusing on the reassurance that Noah remained stable and healthy, but she noticed the seriousness in Dr. Whitaker's tone when he mentioned that hospitals sometimes collaborate with national pediatric research programs studying rare genetic immunity traits. Dr. Whitaker clarified that participation in such programs would be entirely voluntary and would involve long-term monitoring rather than invasive treatment, and he stressed that many families declined involvement because of privacy concerns and the emotional pressure that often accompanied public attention surrounding rare medical cases. Emily asked whether these discoveries meant Noah might face health challenges later in life, and Dr. Whitaker explained that current evidence suggested the opposite possibility, indicating that Noah's immune profile might offer protective benefits rather than risks, although ongoing observation would be necessary to confirm those projections. The meeting concluded with Dr. Whitaker providing Emily with informational brochures describing pediatric research ethics, patient confidentiality protections, and parental consent guidelines, all printed in clear, accessible language designed to help families make informed decisions without pressure. After the consultation, Emily remained seated in the quiet room long after the doctor left, staring at Noah's peaceful expression while absorbing the weight of information she had just received, realizing that her son's fragile beginning might hold scientific significance far beyond what she had imagined during her pregnancy. Over the next several days, Emily met with hospital counselors who explained potential opportunities for financial assistance, specialized pediatric support programs, and national research grants that occasionally accompanied participation in genetic immunity studies. Yet each conversation carried subtle reminders that public exposure could follow such involvement, including interviews, medical conferences, and educational campaigns that might transform Noah into a symbol, rather than allowing him to experience an ordinary childhood. Emily carefully reviewed consent documents while balancing her protective instincts against the possibility that Noah's condition might contribute to life-saving discoveries for other children, and she found herself returning repeatedly to the same question about whether sharing his medical story would serve his best interests or simply satisfy scientific curiosity. During one counseling session, a hospital social worker mentioned that extended family support often helped parents navigate decisions involving long-term research participation, gently suggesting that Emily might consider informing Margaret about Noah's unique medical profile, but Emily hesitated, remembering her mother's earlier reluctance to even visit the hospital, and she quietly concluded that sharing such sensitive information with someone who had distanced herself emotionally might expose Noah to judgment or unwanted pressure. Instead, Emily chose to maintain strict confidentiality, signing documentation that allowed doctors to monitor Noah's immune development privately without enrolling him in public research registries. A decision that surprised several hospital administrators who recognized the potential scientific value of his case, but respected Emily's parental authority and commitment to safeguarding her son's privacy. Meanwhile, Noah continued reaching discharge readiness milestones, maintaining stable body temperature without incubator assistance and successfully consuming full feeding volumes measured in carefully calculated ounces that satisfied pediatric nutritional guidelines, achievements celebrated by nurses who had followed his progress since birth. Rachel Bennett remained by Emily's side during these final hospital preparations, helping organize medical supply orders that included specialized formula, monitoring thermometers, and pediatric follow-up appointment schedules. And although Rachel sensed that Emily carried unspoken concerns following recent doctor consultations, she respected Emily's choice to share information only when she felt comfortable. As discharge day approached, Emily stood beside Noah's bassinet one evening watching city lights glow through the hospital window while reflecting on the fragile path that had brought them both to this moment, realizing that her son carried a hidden strength that neither Margaret nor most relatives would ever fully understand. And as she adjusted Noah's blanket and whispered promises about protecting his future, Emily made a silent commitment to prioritize his emotional well-being above every opportunity, recognition, or scientific breakthrough that might one day seek to define his life. The day Emily Carter carried Noah Carter out of the hospital, she stepped into a life defined by schedules, responsibilities, and quiet determination that replaced every expectation she once held about early motherhood. Nurses lined the discharge hallway offering encouraging smiles as Emily carefully secured Noah into a rear-facing car seat that had been inspected twice by hospital safety staff. And although the winter air outside felt sharp and unfamiliar after weeks indoors, Emily welcomed the sensation as proof that both she and her son had reached a new beginning. Rachel Bennett followed closely behind carrying medical supply bags filled with pediatric formula, sterilized feeding equipment, digital thermometers, and instruction packets detailing every follow-up appointment scheduled across the next several months. And as they loaded the car, Emily realized she was leaving behind the constant presence of medical professionals and stepping into a reality where she would become Noah's primary protector, nurse, and emotional support without daily reassurance from specialists. Emily returned to her small one-bedroom apartment located on the second floor of a modest complex near downtown Columbus, a space she had prepared months earlier with cheerful nursery decorations and a rocking chair positioned beside a window overlooking a quiet parking lot. But as she entered carrying Noah for the first time, the apartment felt both comforting and overwhelming as she mentally reviewed every instruction she had memorized during hospital training sessions. Rachel stayed for the first several days, helping Emily organize medication schedules, labeling storage containers for formula preparation, and setting alarms to remind Emily of feeding intervals measured in precise ounces and minutes. Yet even with Rachel's presence, Emily quickly recognized that her life had transformed into a continuous cycle of monitoring Noah's breathing patterns, recording temperature readings, and documenting feeding tolerance in a detailed notebook recommended by pediatric specialists. Financial pressure emerged almost immediately as Emily calculated hospital bills, therapy expenses, and reduced income from extended maternity leave, prompting her to accept part-time remote administrative work that allowed her to remain home while Noah rested in a bassinet position beside her computer desk, and she often worked late into the evening after completing medical routines, driven by a quiet fear that any financial instability might compromise Noah's access to specialized pediatric care. Weekly pediatric visits became a central rhythm of their lives, requiring Emily to drive across town regardless of weather conditions, carefully packing emergency supplies and medical records before every appointment, and doctors consistently praised Noah's steady growth as he gradually gained weight and demonstrated improving muscle coordination, milestones that reassured Emily while reminding her of the fragile journey they had already overcome. During these visits, Emily occasionally encountered other parents who discussed family support networks and shared caregiving responsibilities, conversations that Emily listened to politely while avoiding mention of her strained relationship with Margaret Carter, choosing instead to focus on Noah's progress and the gratitude she felt for Rachel's ongoing assistance. Rachel balanced her own career responsibilities while continuing to visit regularly, bringing groceries, assisting with household cleaning, and occasionally staying overnight when Emily appeared physically exhausted. Yet Rachel also encouraged Emily to build independence, gently reminding her that long-term resilience would require confidence in her own abilities as a single parent navigating complex medical routines. As months passed, Noah developed stronger vocal responses and began smiling during feeding sessions, moments that filled Emily with profound emotional relief, and reinforced her belief that every sacrifice she made contributed directly to his happiness and stability. Despite these positive developments, Emily occasionally noticed unopened messages from Margaret appearing on her phone, usually brief inquiries about Noah's health or offers to send financial assistance. But the messages lacked emotional warmth and rarely acknowledged the months of absence that had shaped Emily's experience, leading her to respond politely but without extending invitations for visits or deeper conversations. Emily maintained her decision to protect Noah's privacy regarding his rare immune characteristics, declining follow-up research invitations sent by hospital administrators, while focusing entirely on building a peaceful home environment that prioritized routine, comfort, and emotional security. As Noah approached his 6-month developmental evaluation, pediatric specialists confirmed that he had surpassed several growth expectations typically associated with premature infants, demonstrating motor coordination and cognitive responsiveness that impressed his medical team. Yet Emily remained cautious about celebrating publicly, preferring quiet evenings spent rocking Noah near the apartment window where city lights reflected softly across his curious eyes. During one of these evenings, Emily realized that the fear and uncertainty that once dominated her hospital days had transformed into unwavering resolve, understanding that motherhood had redefined her identity through responsibility rather than expectation. And as she watched Noah drift peacefully to sleep against her shoulder, she accepted that her journey forward would continue without the parental guidance she once relied upon, strengthened instead by a bond with her son that grew deeper. With every challenge they faced together, Margaret Carter began to notice the silence in her home differently as the seasons shifted from late winter into early summer, discovering that the routine she had once protected so carefully now felt strangely hollow, especially during quiet mornings when sunlight filtered through her kitchen windows and illuminated the empty chair where she often imagined a small child might have sat eating breakfast cereal and asking innocent questions about the world. She maintained her structured lifestyle, attending community meetings, volunteering at the local library literacy program, and participating in her weekly bridge club gatherings, yet conversations about family milestones increasingly surrounded her as friends proudly shared photographs of grandchildren learning to crawl, celebrate birthdays, and take first steps, moments that stirred emotions Margaret struggled to acknowledge openly. Rachel Bennett occasionally mentioned Noah Carter's progress during family gatherings, describing his bright curiosity, steady physical growth, and cheerful personality that seemed to bring calmness to everyone who interacted with him. And although Margaret listened attentively, she often redirected conversations toward general health updates or financial planning, attempting to maintain emotional distance while quietly absorbing every detail Rachel shared. Margaret kept several printed photographs of Noah on her refrigerator, images Rachel had mailed during earlier months showing him wrapped in soft blankets and smiling with wide blue eyes. And although Margaret rarely discussed those photographs, she found herself studying them during late evening hours when the house felt unusually still, tracing the outline of Noah's features and recognizing familiar expressions that reminded her of Emily Carter's childhood. Despite these moments of reflection, Margaret hesitated to contact Emily directly, weighed down by pride and uncertainty about how her absence during Noah's earliest months might be received, and instead she composed short text messages offering financial assistance or asking brief questions about Noah's pediatric appointments, messages that Emily acknowledged politely, but without inviting deeper conversation or emotional reconciliation. Margaret's internal conflict intensified when she attended a community health seminar focused on early childhood development where guest speakers emphasized the importance of intergenerational family bonding and building emotional resilience for children. And as she listened to pediatric counselors describe how consistent grandparent involvement often strengthened family stability, Margaret felt an uncomfortable realization that her earlier decisions might have deprived Noah of experiences she had once championed during her own career as an educator. After the seminar, Margaret remained seated long after other attendees departed, reflecting on memories of Emily's upbringing and recalling moments when she had promised to support her daughter through every stage of life, promises that now echoed against the reality of her absence during Noah's most vulnerable months. Margaret attempted to justify her decisions by focusing on practical concerns about her age and financial limitations, reminding herself that premature infants often required complex care that she felt unprepared to provide. Yet these explanations gradually felt less convincing as Rachel continued describing Noah's remarkable adaptability and Emily's unwavering dedication to motherhood. Meanwhile, Emily Carter remained focused entirely on Noah's development, maintaining a carefully balanced routine of pediatric appointments, early childhood therapy sessions, and structured playtime designed to strengthen Noah's motor and cognitive skills, all while managing her remote work responsibilities and household obligations with quiet efficiency. Rachel continued serving as Emily's primary emotional support, visiting regularly and celebrating Noah's developmental milestones with genuine enthusiasm, and although Rachel occasionally suggested that Emily might consider reconnecting with Margaret for Noah's benefit, Emily responded cautiously, explaining that trust required time and consistency, rather than sudden reconciliation driven by guilt or external pressure. Margaret's sense of regret deepened further when she attended a neighborhood baby shower hosted by a longtime friend whose daughter had recently welcomed twins. And as Margaret watched multiple generations gather around the expectant mother offering advice, laughter, and emotional reassurance, she felt a wave of realization that family presence often extended beyond practical caregiving, representing continuity and emotional security that could not be replaced by financial assistance or polite distance. That evening, Margaret returned home and reviewed a box of family photo albums stored in her hallway closet, flipping through images capturing Emily's childhood milestones including school award ceremonies, holiday traditions, and family vacations filled with laughter and shared memories. And as Margaret reached the final pages showing Emily preparing for motherhood during her pregnancy, she experienced a quiet recognition that her fear of responsibility had overshadowed her lifelong commitment to family loyalty. Margaret considered visiting Emily unannounced several times, even driving past Emily's apartment complex on one occasion before deciding to continue home, overwhelmed by uncertainty about whether her presence would be welcomed or interpreted as an attempt to erase months of absence with a single gesture. As summer progressed, Margaret found herself pausing longer when reading Rachel's update messages about Noah learning to sit independently and responding joyfully to music played during therapy sessions, realizing that each new milestone represented time she could never recover. And as she stared at the photographs displayed across her refrigerator door, Margaret began to understand that her earlier decision had not simply created physical distance, but had quietly reshaped the emotional foundation of her relationship with both Emily and Noah in ways she was only beginning to fully comprehend. By the time Noah Carter reached his 4th birthday, his development had surpassed nearly every expectation doctors had originally outlined during his neonatal care, demonstrating strong cognitive awareness, advanced language skills, and an unusual resilience to common childhood illnesses that pediatric specialists quietly continued to monitor with professional fascination. Emily Carter had built a stable routine centered entirely around Noah's growth, enrolling him in a small early learning program known for its individualized developmental approach while maintaining regular medical evaluations recommended by Dr. Leonard Whitaker and his pediatric immunology team, appointments that remained confidential and carefully documented without public exposure. Noah quickly became known among his teachers as a curious and observant child who asked thoughtful questions about science experiments, nature documentaries, and classroom activities, often displaying emotional sensitivity toward classmates who struggled with separation anxiety or learning challenges, qualities that Emily encouraged by creating a home environment filled with books, educational toys, and structured bedtime reading rituals that strengthened Noah's communication skills. During a routine annual medical evaluation, Dr. Whitaker informed Emily that Noah's immune system markers continued to demonstrate patterns rarely observed in pediatric research, explaining that long-term tracking had revealed unusually strong antibody responses even after minimal exposure to common viruses, findings that had quietly attracted attention from a national pediatric research consortium dedicated to studying rare natural immunity profiles. Dr. Whitaker explained that recent advancements in pediatric immunology had increased interest in naturally occurring immune resistance among children, particularly those who had survived premature birth yet demonstrated accelerated protective responses, and he gently asked whether Emily might reconsider allowing Noah to participate in a controlled national study that would remain ethically monitored and focused entirely on long-term observation, rather than experimental treatment. Emily listened carefully, recalling her earlier decision to protect Noah's privacy, but she also recognized that Noah was now older and emotionally stable, and after extensive consultation with child psychologists and pediatric counselors, she agreed to allow limited participation under strict confidentiality agreements that restricted public disclosure of Noah's identity. Over the following months, Noah underwent several advanced but non-invasive medical evaluations conducted by research specialists who praised his cooperation and curiosity during laboratory visits, often explaining scientific equipment to him in child-friendly language that fascinated Noah and inspired his growing interest in biology and health sciences. The research team documented Noah's immune profile as part of a broader national data registry, and although Emily maintained strict privacy boundaries, preliminary findings were eventually presented during a national pediatric medical conference, where specialists discussed the significance of naturally occurring immune adaptations among premature infants who demonstrated exceptional recovery outcomes. The presentation generated significant interest among medical professionals, leading to published research summaries that described an anonymous pediatric case from Ohio whose immune development patterns suggested potential pathways for future childhood infection prevention strategies. Rachel Bennett learned about the conference presentation through professional networking connections and shared the news with extended family members, including Margaret Carter, who encountered the information through an online article summarizing the conference findings and describing the anonymous child whose biological resilience had captured national medical attention. Margaret initially read the article casually while browsing, knowing the emotional implications of revealing the connection, but she eventually confirmed that the anonymous research case referenced Noah's immune development, explaining that Emily had protected Noah's identity to preserve his privacy, while allowing doctors to study his biological uniqueness for broader medical advancement. Margaret experienced a wave of conflicting emotions as she processed the information, recognizing that the grandson she had distanced herself from during his earliest vulnerability now represented a medical breakthrough that might influence pediatric healthcare nationwide. And she spent several hours rereading the article, focusing on descriptions of resilience, parental dedication, and the extraordinary biological factors that had contributed to Noah's progress. Meanwhile, Emily remained unaware that the research presentation had reached extended family circles, continuing her routine of school activities, pediatric monitoring, and quiet family celebrations that marked Noah's developmental achievements, including his recent fascination with science kits and his enthusiastic participation in classroom health awareness projects. Margaret struggled to process the emotional weight of learning about Noah's medical significance, while remembering her earlier decision to remain absent during his fragile infancy, realizing that the opportunity to witness his earliest milestones had been replaced by second-hand updates and public recognition she had never anticipated. As Margaret sat alone reviewing printed copies of the research article placed beside Noah's childhood photographs, she began to understand that her grandson's story extended far beyond medical innovation, representing resilience, sacrifice, and maternal devotion that had unfolded entirely without her presence, a realization that quietly prepared her for the emotional confrontation she knew could no longer be postponed. Margaret Carter spent several weeks gathering the courage to visit Emily Carter, rehearsing possible conversations while sitting alone at her dining table, and repeatedly rereading the medical article that described Noah Carter's immune resilience as a milestone in pediatric research, until one quiet Saturday morning she finally decided that delaying any longer would only deepen the distance she had already created. She drove slowly toward Emily's apartment complex, passing familiar neighborhoods where she had once driven Emily to school and extracurricular activities, memories that surfaced with unexpected clarity as she parked near the entrance and remained seated inside her car, gripping the steering wheel while questioning whether her arrival would reopen emotional wounds rather than begin healing them. Meanwhile, Emily was helping Noah prepare for a weekend science fair organized by his Early Learning Center, guiding him through assembling a simple demonstration about hand hygiene and germ prevention that he had practiced enthusiastically throughout the week. And their apartment carried the calm rhythm of a household built around routine, educational curiosity, and quiet emotional stability. When the doorbell rang, Emily glanced through the peephole and immediately recognized Margaret standing outside holding a small gift bag and a folded envelope, her posture hesitant and uncertain in a way Emily had never seen before, and after a brief pause, Emily opened the door while maintaining a composed expression that revealed neither welcome nor rejection. Margaret greeted her daughter with a soft voice that carried visible nervousness, explaining that she hoped to talk privately if Emily felt comfortable, and Emily nodded silently before inviting her inside, guiding her toward the living room where Noah's science materials were carefully arranged across a coffee table covered with colorful posters and educational diagrams. Noah glanced curiously toward Margaret but remained focused on sorting plastic demonstration tools, unaware of the emotional weight surrounding the moment. while Emily offered Margaret a seat and waited patiently as her mother struggled to find the words she had rehearsed countless times during sleepless nights. Margaret finally spoke, acknowledging that she had learned about Noah's remarkable medical significance and confessing that the discovery forced her to confront the reality of her absence during his earliest and most vulnerable months, her voice trembling as she admitted that fear, pride, and uncertainty had guided her decisions rather than the family loyalty she had always taught Emily to value. Emily listened quietly without interrupting, maintaining steady eye contact while allowing Margaret to continue expressing regret, apology, and recognition that her earlier refusal had left emotional scars that could not be erased simply through acknowledgement or delayed affection. Margaret explained that she did not expect immediate forgiveness but hoped to rebuild trust gradually, emphasizing that she wanted to become part of Noah's life in whatever capacity Emily felt appropriate, even if that involvement began with occasional visits or participation in family milestones, rather than assuming a traditional grandparent role. Emily responded with measured honesty, explaining that the months following Noah's birth had reshaped her understanding of trust, responsibility, and emotional reliability, and she described the loneliness she experienced during hospital recovery and early motherhood, while learning to navigate complex medical routines without the parental support she had always assumed would be present. She clarified that Noah had grown into a confident and joyful child surrounded by consistent routines and dependable emotional relationships, and she expressed concern that introducing family members who had previously chosen distance might create confusion or instability if not approached carefully and respectfully. Margaret nodded in understanding, tears forming as she acknowledged that Emily's caution reflected protection rather than punishment, and she assured Emily that she was willing to follow any boundaries necessary to earn a place in Noah's life. During their conversation, Noah approached curiously, holding a laminated poster about proper hand-washing techniques and asking Emily to review his presentation steps, and Emily gently introduced Margaret as his grandmother, prompting Noah to smile politely and explain his science project with enthusiastic detail, unaware of the history shaping the moment. Margaret listened attentively, visibly moved by Noah's confidence and kindness, recognizing familiar expressions that mirrored Emily's childhood enthusiasm, and she responded warmly by praising his presentation and asking thoughtful questions that encouraged his excitement rather than overwhelming him with emotion. As Noah returned to organizing his demonstration materials, Emily explained that she would allow gradual interaction between Margaret and Noah under conditions that prioritize stability, consistency, and honest communication, emphasizing that trust would develop through reliable presence rather than emotional promises alone. Margaret accepted these terms with quiet gratitude, understanding that rebuilding family relationships required patience and accountability rather than immediate reconciliation, and as she prepared to leave, she paused at the doorway to thank Emily for allowing the conversation to begin, acknowledging that even this opportunity represented more generosity than she deserved. Emily watched Margaret walk toward her car while Noah practiced his science demonstration inside the apartment, realizing that the confrontation had not erased past pain but had created the first fragile step toward understanding, a step that would require time, honesty, and emotional responsibility from both women, as they navigated the complicated process of redefining their family connection. Emily stood near the wide kitchen window of her small suburban home in Cedar Grove, watching the late afternoon sun stretch across the quiet backyard, while baby Oliver rested peacefully in his bassinet beside the dining table, his tiny chest rising and falling with steady, reassuring rhythm. The house carried a calm warmth that had taken months to rebuild, not through grand gestures but through steady routines, patient healing, and the quiet strength that Emily had discovered inside herself after everything she had endured. Across the room, Daniel sorted through a stack of insurance papers and medical statements, not because they still needed urgent attention, but because organizing them had become his way of grounding himself after months of uncertainty. Emily turned as she heard the familiar creak of the front porch step, a sound that had once filled her with dread, but now simply signaled another complicated chapter slowly settling into something manageable. Margaret stood outside holding a small paper bag from the local bakery, her posture uncertain yet determined, her expression carrying the weight of a woman who had spent many sleepless nights confronting her own choices. Emily walked to the door and opened it without hesitation, offering a gentle but measured smile that reflected both kindness and the firm boundaries she had built. Margaret stepped inside quietly, her eyes immediately searching for Oliver, and Emily nodded toward the bassinet, allowing her mother to approach while remaining close enough to signal both trust and caution. Margaret leaned over the bassinet, her shoulders trembling slightly as she watched Oliver stretch his tiny fingers, and she whispered softly about how strong he looked, how peaceful he seemed, how she had once feared she would never be allowed to witness moments like this again. Emily listened without interrupting, understanding that forgiveness was not a single decision, but a series of quiet allowances given over time. Daniel rose from the table and greeted Margaret politely, his calm presence reinforcing the fragile but genuine progress that had grown between all of them. Margaret handed Emily the bakery bag, explaining that she remembered Emily loving cinnamon rolls during childhood Sunday mornings, a memory she had nearly forgotten until she began sorting through old photo albums during her long nights of reflection. Emily accepted the bag and thanked her, acknowledging the gesture while maintaining the emotional balance she had worked so hard to establish. The afternoon unfolded slowly as Margaret sat on the living room sofa, occasionally glancing toward Oliver while speaking carefully about the counseling sessions she had attended, the support groups she had joined, and the difficult realizations she had faced about fear, pride, and the harmful distance she had once mistaken for protection. Emily listened, occasionally asking gentle questions that demonstrated openness without surrendering her emotional safety, and Daniel quietly prepared coffee, adding just the right amount of cream the way Margaret had once preferred, signaling that reconciliation could exist without forgetting past pain. As the sun dipped lower, Oliver stirred and began to fuss softly, and Emily lifted him carefully, cradling him against her shoulder while pacing the living room with practiced confidence. Margaret watched, tears forming again, but this time they reflected gratitude rather than regret. After a few moments, Emily paused beside Margaret and allowed her to touch Oliver's tiny hand, a small but powerful gesture that marked how far they had come. Margaret whispered promises about learning to support rather than control, about respecting Emily's strength as a mother, and about being present without imposing expectations. Emily nodded quietly, knowing that words alone would never erase the past, but consistent actions might build something new. Later that evening, Daniel grilled chicken on the back patio, while Emily set the table with simple dishes and soft yellow napkins that matched the warm string lights Daniel had installed during Emily. That the greatest victory was not proving anyone wrong, but creating a safe and loving future for her son, one steady day at a time.